He stood there laughing at me in court. Too poor, he called me. Too defeated. He didn't see the single devastating piece of paper I held, tucked into my worn folder. He thought I was fighting for alimony. I was fighting for his prison sentence. How did I get the evidence he thought was destroyed? Who helped me plan this destruction? He never knew his broke wife was about to sign his death warrant. The air in the courtroom tasted like dust and impending destruction. My hands were slick against the worn manila folder, the only shield I had against a man who had built his empire on the silent suffering of others, including mine. Robert, my husband, or rather, the soon-to-be ex-husband, sat across the room with the easy arrogance of a monarch surveying his doomed subjects. His expensive silk tie a visual representation of the decades of lies he'd spun into gold. 30 years. 3 decades of building a life, a family, a legacy, only to have him casually dismantle it all with a signature and a condescending shrug when he found a younger model. A woman half my age who promised him perpetual youth and fewer wrinkles to worry about. The infidelity was a dull ache, a predictable cliché. It was the sheer contempt that burned hotter than any betrayal. He wasn't just leaving me. He was erasing me, convinced that without his resources, I was nothing more than an aging black woman with a failed degree and no financial standing. He'd even had the audacity to suggest that my choice to represent myself, pro se, was proof of my penury, a pathetic last gasp of a woman too unstable and unemployable to afford real counsel. His lawyer, a granite-faced woman who seemed to view me as a minor inconvenience to her lunch break, kept passing Robert notes, and every time he read one, his smile widened, a smug, satisfied curl of the lip that fueled the growing, cold fury in my gut. They thought this was a formality, a simple rubber stamp on their prenuptial dominance. But what they didn't know was that while they were busy checking off their legal boxes, I had been diligently, patiently, and quietly excavating the very foundations of his financial fortress, following threads he thought were long buried under mountains of corporate filings and offshore accounts. And what I found was far more damning than a mistress or a hidden asset. It was the key to an old, dark secret, and my heart hammered a terrifying rhythm against my ribs, because I knew the moment I opened that folder, their practiced composure would shatter into a million pieces, revealing the fear underneath the veneer of entitlement. But the question that gnawed at me, tightening the knot in my stomach, was whether I truly had the strength to launch the devastating blow that would end not just his marriage but his entire professional life. And what if the evidence, the one piece I had counted on, somehow evaporated under the harsh light of judicial scrutiny, leaving me completely exposed and humiliated, just as he predicted? The judge called the case, and the sound of my name, Alara Jenkins, echoed with a hollow formality that mocked the intimate, violent disintegration of my life. I stood up, adjusting the jacket of the modest suit I'd bought on clearance, acutely aware of the judge's skeptical gaze and Robert's barely suppressed snort from across the room. He was the picture of success, powerful, refined, and utterly ruthless, a man who believed his money made him untouchable, a veritable demigod in the mortal coil of family court. The sheer disparity between us was crushing. He had an army of expensive litigators and forensic accountants, and I had a filing cabinet full of documents, a library card, and a burning desire for justice that transcended mere alimony. Every question his lawyer lobbed at me was designed to belittle, to paint me as an emotional, uneducated, and financially dependent caricature, the quintessential scorned wife who had nothing of substance to contribute to their shared wealth. Mrs. Jenkins, can you confirm that you have no professional certifications, no current employment, and that your only income for the last 2 decades has been derived from your husband's business accounts? The question was a low blow, perfectly crafted to emphasize my supposed irrelevance, and the shame was a bitter metallic taste on my tongue. I answered with a quiet firmness, confirming the truth while refusing to meet Robert's triumphant eye, knowing that my measured response was deceiving them all. They saw compliance, they saw defeat. They didn't see the hours I'd spent poring over corporate tax law, the late nights spent cross-referencing ledger entries, and the quiet, almost invisible network of disgruntled former employees and industry rivals I had cultivated. The pain of the past few months had forged a steel core inside me, transforming the once grieving spouse into an avenging agent of reckoning, and I realized that my most valuable asset wasn't a bank account or a law degree, but my proximity to his life, my 30 years of quiet observation, during which I had memorized the cracks in his armor and the lies that glued his facade together, a secret, devastating blueprint for his downfall that he never once considered I was capable of deciphering. But the question that kept echoing in the empty spaces of my mind was whether the judge, already biased by the appearance of professional representation, would even grant me the necessary procedural latitude to introduce the kind of unorthodox, yet absolutely crucial evidence I had painstakingly acquired, evidence that flew in the face of Robert's meticulously constructed narrative of blameless prosperity. Robert leaned forward, his voice a stage whisper designed to carry just far enough to reach the court reporter and the judge's ear without drawing a formal reprimand. "Elara, darling," he drawled, the false endearment a poisonous dart. "Must you drag this out? The only thing you're proving is how little you truly understood about my business. Frankly, this entire performance is embarrassing. If you just signed the papers, I could have given you a generous settlement, enough for that little cottage you always wanted. Now you'll be lucky to walk away with bus fare." His words were a calculated strike, aimed at my deep-seated fear of financial precarity, the fear that had kept me compliant and quiet for years. The sheer audacity of his condescension almost made me laugh, a hysterical broken sound I quickly swallowed. He genuinely believed that a small provincial cottage was the pinnacle of my ambition, proving that he hadn't known the real me for decades. The man I married, the ambitious, slightly rough around the edges young man, had been consumed by the corporate beast, replaced by this polished, monstrous effigy who measured human worth only in quarterly profits and stock options. His mockery, however, served a purpose far beyond simple cruelty. It was a distraction, a verbal smokescreen intended to keep my focus on the emotional fallout rather than the cold, hard facts of the case. He wanted me to be angry, to be tearful, to make a dramatic mistake that would allow his lawyer to strike my testimony. But I refused to grant him the satisfaction. I looked past his sneer, past the polished mahogany of the courtroom, and focused instead on the one thing that kept me grounded, the meticulous timeline I had constructed, a secret map detailing every unethical maneuver and every fraudulent transaction he had executed over the past decade. It was a dense, interlocking puzzle of deception, and the piece I held in my hand was the critical nexus point. The transaction that proved intent and connected a myriad of seemingly unrelated crimes, transforming a simple divorce case into a criminal investigation. Yet, even as I felt the quiet, powerful certainty of my eventual victory, a tremor of doubt ran through me, a chilling realization that if Robert was this confident, he might have a contingency plan I hadn't anticipated, a secret partner or a deeply entrenched cover-up that could still nullify the single fragile piece of paper that held my entire strategy together. And the fear was a cold knot of dread that maybe, just maybe, I was walking into a trap set by a man far more dangerous and resourceful than I had given him credit for, a man who had already outmaneuvered me on countless occasions when I was not looking. The single piece of evidence that gave me this terrifying, exhilarating sense of power was not some grand legal discovery. It was mundane in appearance, a simple water-stained internal memo dated 12 years ago, relating to a shell corporation registered in a remote Caribbean island. To the untrained eye, it was corporate minutiae, utterly meaningless in the context of a high-net-worth divorce. But I had spent 4 months locked away in the spare bedroom, which I had secretly converted into a forensic research lab, cross-referencing that memo with obscure international trade reports and long-forgotten annual shareholder meetings. I found it tucked away in an old, dusty box of miscellaneous correspondence that Robert had intended to discard but had forgotten in the rush of moving his belongings out of our home, a serendipitous error born of his utter faith in my financial ignorance. He saw me as a homemaker, a hostess, a charitable foundation spouse, never as a meticulous chronicler of his every fiscal move. He'd often leave important files scattered on his study floor, knowing I would dutifully pick them up and file them away, never once suspecting that I was reading, understanding, and storing the most damning details in my memory. The irony was intoxicating. His own sloppiness, a symptom of his deep contempt for my intelligence, was now the weapon that would fell him. I had made 5 copies of that memo, stored them in 5 different geographically distant locations, and memorized every line of text, every footnote, every illegible signature, because I knew that if he even suspected its existence, he would stop at nothing to retrieve and destroy it. The weight of that knowledge, the terrible power of holding his fate in my hands, was almost unbearable, but it also tasted like the sweetest redemption. I was no longer the humiliated wife. I was the architect of justice, the quiet storm that was about to break over his impeccably groomed head. The judge cleared his throat, a sharp, impatient sound that signaled the end of the preliminary arguments, and the moment was upon me, the point of no return where I had to move from defense to offense, and I swallowed the lump of fear in my throat, trying to project a confidence I was only just beginning to truly inhabit. Yet the fear persisted, a cold, nagging voice whispering that there might be a fatal flaw in my understanding of the document, a single legal loophole that Robert's highly paid counsel was already prepared to exploit, turning my moment of triumph into an embarrassing public defeat. It was time. Robert's lawyer, Ms. Thorne, concluded her character assassination by asking the court to limit my discovery requests, citing them as vexatious and purely designed to harass my client. I felt the heat rising in my face, but I kept my voice steady, my gaze fixed on the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and surprisingly strong, cutting through the courtroom's suffocating silence. "I object to the characterization of harassment. My discovery requests are necessary because they relate directly to Mr. Jenkins's true assets, which I believe he has deliberately and unlawfully concealed. To be precise, Your Honor, I am referring to the total capitalization of Parnassus Ventures, a holding company Mr. Jenkins has repeatedly failed to disclose on any financial affidavit." Robert actually laughed, a quick, dismissive burst that earned him a stern look from the bench. "Your Honor, Parnassus was dissolved 8 years ago," Ms. Thorne interjected, her tone dripping with professional exasperation, as if correcting a confused child. "It was a failed venture, liquidated with 0 remaining assets. Mrs. Jenkins clearly has outdated information." The confident dismissal was exactly what I had prepared for. I paused, allowing the confident denial to settle, and then reached into the manila folder, not pulling out the internal memo, but a simple, laminated printout from the state's corporate commission website, which I handed to the court clerk. "With all due respect to opposing counsel, Your Honor, Parnassus Ventures was not liquidated. It was, in fact, silently reorganized under a different jurisdiction in Delaware 6 years ago. Furthermore, according to this publicly available filing, which I obtained just last week, Mr. Jenkins is listed as the sole director of Parnassus, and the company's stated net worth is not 0, but a rather impressive $93 million. A ripple of stunned silence spread through the courtroom. Ms. Thorne's perfectly sculpted expression faltered, a flash of pure, unadulterated shock briefly crossing her face before she frantically grabbed a laptop. But the real satisfaction came from Robert. His face, usually so composed, went pale, the color draining away as if pulled by an unseen drain, and he leaned back, his eyes darting from me to his lawyer, a desperate, cornered animal look replacing his earlier smugness, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly dissolved, and the sheer audacity of finding this needle in the haystack, a secret company name change he thought was foolproof, had thrown their entire legal defense into immediate disarray. But the biggest mystery still remained. If he was hiding $93 million from the divorce, what other darker secret was that specific sum of money actually meant to conceal? And how was it connected to the internal memo I still held tightly in my trembling hand? The courtroom was no longer silent. It buzzed with low, urgent whispers, a sudden electric charge of drama replacing the earlier boredom. The judge, clearly thrown by the unexpected introduction of a massive, undisclosed asset, leaned forward, his expression now one of serious judicial scrutiny. He ordered a 5-minute recess, ostensibly to allow Miss Thorne to review the documentation, but the recess was clearly a lifeline thrown to Robert's sinking ship. I watched as Miss Thorne, her composure officially shattered, hissed at Robert, jabbing her finger at the printout with visible fury. Robert, his face a mask of impotent rage and dawning fear, kept shaking his head, muttering, "Impossible. That company was supposed to be dormant. How did she find that?" His eyes, when they finally met mine across the receding crowd of people, were no longer mocking. They were venomous, filled with a raw, dangerous threat that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was a look that confirmed everything. The concealment was deliberate, the amount was real, and he knew this was just the beginning of his unraveling. I understood then that I was no longer fighting for a fair divorce settlement. I was engaged in a battle for survival against a man who would view exposure as an existential threat. The sheer magnitude of the hidden fortune gave me temporary leverage, but it also put a target squarely on my back. $93 million doesn't just disappear and reappear by accident. It's a testament to years of meticulous, possibly criminal, financial engineering. I had just introduced the possibility of perjury, contempt of court, and massive tax fraud into what was supposed to be a simple marital dissolution, and I knew Robert's next move would be swift, ruthless, and outside the bounds of the court's jurisdiction. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a dizzying sense of isolation. I was alone, a pro-se litigant in a borrowed suit, facing down a corporate titan with unlimited resources and a demonstrated lack of conscience, and the question that screamed in my mind was whether my carefully constructed security measures, the 5 hidden copies, the anonymous bank vault, were truly enough to protect me from the full weight of a man who suddenly had everything to lose, and what would happen if Robert decided to preemptively strike against the one person who helped me get the information in the first place, an informant I had promised absolute anonymity to protect from this very kind of vengeful backlash? During the brief recess, Robert, ignoring the sharp warnings of his panicked lawyer, marched across the aisle, stopping just short of my table. His voice was low, strained, and laced with a terrifying mix of disbelief and threat. "Where did you get that filing, Alara? Tell me now. Did you steal it? Did you break into my office? You don't have the sophistication for this, so who is helping you?" He was violating every rule of decorum, his entire polished facade cracking under the pressure of the $73 million revelation. I met his gaze directly, holding firm, refusing to flinch under the weight of his intimidation. "I found it, Robert," I stated simply, my voice even, refusing to be drawn into a shouting match that would only serve his narrative of the hysterical ex-wife. "I looked where you didn't think I would. I read what you assumed I was too dull to comprehend. 30 years, Robert. I know your filing system better than you do, and I certainly know your lies better than your lawyer." The truth of my statement, the chilling reality that the person closest to him was his undoing, hit him with visible force. His fists clenched, the expensive silk of his tie suddenly looking like a garrote around his neck. He was desperate, and desperate men are the most dangerous. Miss Thorne finally pulled him back, dragging him away from the proximity of contempt of court, but not before Robert leaned in, his final words a low, chilling promise. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed, Alara. You think you're smart, but you're about to find out how far I'm willing to go to protect my company. You don't have the stomach for this fight." The threat hung in the air, thick and metallic, but it had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of fear, I felt a surging validation. His panic was the proof of my strategy's efficacy, the sound of the steel trap snapping shut. He was reacting to the $93 million bait. Now it was time to deploy the real trap, the one piece of paper that tied the money to something far more sinister than simple tax evasion. Something that would not just cost him his fortune but would irrevocably shatter his reputation and potentially lead to criminal prosecution. But I still had to wait for the right procedural moment, the precise instant when the judge's suspicion was high and Robert's arrogance was low, yet the fear of him acting first, of him using his vast network to discredit me or tamper with my remaining evidence before I could present it, was a constant gnawing anxiety. A race against the clock where the stakes were not just my financial future, but perhaps my physical safety. The judge returned, his face grave, and the entire atmosphere shifted from adversarial to quasi-investigative. Miss Thorne, having apparently realized the impossibility of disproving a public corporate filing in 5 minutes, took a desperate tactical pivot. She argued that even if Parnassus Ventures existed, it was a separate legal entity and irrelevant to the marital estate, which was governed by the laws of our residing state. It was a decent legal argument, a last-ditch attempt to box the $93 million back into its corporate cage. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I stood, calm despite the tremor in my hands, and addressed the court. Your Honor, Parnassus Ventures is not just an irrelevant corporate entity. It is the direct recipient of a series of large, undocumented wire transfers from Mr. Jenkins's primary business account, the very account he claimed was losing money, and was the sole reason for downsizing his alimony offer. I then presented my second piece of evidence, a neatly compiled color-coded spreadsheet charting the wire transfers. It wasn't the internal memo, but a carefully curated distillation of bank records I had obtained through a legal, though highly contentious subpoena. The spreadsheet visually and undeniably connected Robert's supposedly struggling marital business to his secret offshore fortune. But even this was a feint. The link between the two accounts was damning for the divorce case, proving concealment and deceit, but it didn't cross the threshold into criminality. It was enough to force a serious, immediate financial investigation, but not enough to stop Robert's powerful legal machine from dragging the proceedings out for years. I needed the kill shot. The internal memo I held was the missing link, the single document that explained the purpose of the wire transfers, transforming them from mere obfuscation into evidence of a felony. I needed to bridge the gap between financial fraud and something much darker, and the single water-stained piece of paper was the bridge, connecting the money to a product recall scandal that had been quietly suppressed a decade ago. A scandal involving faulty medical devices that had caused significant harm to hundreds of unsuspecting patients, and my entire body was trembling as I prepared to move to the next, crucial step in my strategy, yet the procedural nightmare of introducing such inflammatory evidence, which was not obtained through traditional discovery channels, loomed large, and I worried that I would trip on a technicality and lose the opportunity to present the full, horrifying truth. Your Honor, I continued, pressing the point while the spreadsheet's impact was still fresh in the judge's mind. The nature of these wire transfers is not merely to hide assets from me. The transfers themselves were a breach of fiduciary duty to the shareholders of his publicly traded company. The $93 million was not profit. It was a fund, a secret reserve used to compensate victims who were coerced into signing non-disclosure agreements after suffering injuries from a faulty product produced by a subsidiary of his primary company. In essence, Parnassus Ventures was a slush fund designed to buy the silence of injured parties and illegally avoid a massive public recall. The air was sucked out of the room. This was the first time I had publicly articulated the full, terrifying scope of Robert's long-term deception, moving the narrative entirely from a domestic dispute to a massive corporate cover-up. Miss Thorne finally erupted, leaping to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Rank speculation. This is hearsay, inflammatory, and utterly irrelevant to the proceedings. Mrs. Jenkins is clearly attempting to slander my client. The judge hammered his gavel, his face taut with the gravity of the accusation. Sustained. Ms. Jenkins, you are on thin ice. You must provide a credible link to your claim, or I will strike this entire line of inquiry. This was the moment. I slowly reached into the manila folder and pulled out the single sheet of paper, the internal memo. It looked harmless, almost fragile. Your Honor, I offer for the court's inspection Exhibit A. This is a confidential internal memorandum, written and signed by Mr. Jenkins, explicitly directing the CFO to move the settlement funds for Project Nightingale to the Parnassus offshore account and have all NDAs signed and notarized by Tuesday's deadline. Project Nightingale, Your Honor, was the code name for the faulty medical device that was never recalled, and the memo directly connects the undisclosed $93 million to a deliberate, criminal cover-up that put lives at risk. Robert's reaction was instantaneous and visceral. His eyes widened in pure, paralyzed terror, his jaw slackened, and he half rose from his chair, letting out a choked, almost inhuman sound, as if he had just witnessed a ghost, confirming in that single horrifying moment that the evidence was not only authentic but the very thing he thought he had successfully eradicated from existence, and the knowledge that I had finally used the key piece of evidence, the one that proved not just financial malfeasance but moral depravity, brought a chilling yet satisfying sense of finality. But the question of where this memo had actually come from, the secret source that Robert never suspected, still hung over the proceedings, a mystery that would soon be revealed to be another layer of devastating betrayal. Miss Thorne, recognizing the memo's devastating potential, frantically snatched a copy and began reading it, her face draining of color with every word, whispering to Robert, "This can't be real." But Robert, still frozen, could only stammer, "The shredder." I watched them shred the whole batch. He couldn't take his eyes off the paper, his confession to its authenticity hanging heavy in the air. The judge, having read the document, looked up, his expression one of cold fury. "Mr. Jenkins, this memo is highly disturbing. I will be notifying the appropriate federal authorities immediately. Your assets are hereby frozen, and a full forensic audit is ordered." The world had just stopped for Robert Jenkins. I took a deep breath, the adrenaline finally giving way to a bone-deep weariness, but I had one final move to make regarding the memo's origin, a revelation that would destroy not just his freedom but his final shred of trust. "Your Honor," I stated, addressing the court and turning slightly toward Robert, "I should also inform the court how I was able to find a copy of this memo after Mr. Jenkins attempted to destroy all records." Robert's eyes, wide and wild, focused on me with desperate intensity, begging, silently pleading for me to keep the secret. The memo was given to me, not stolen. It was saved by the one person who had access to Mr. Jenkins's personal safe, the one person he trusted implicitly to handle his most sensitive documents, the one person he convinced to risk their career to help him cover up his crimes, his own brother Marcus Jenkins, who was his CFO and the person who initially processed the wire transfer. The silence this time was absolute. Robert didn't just go pale. He seemed to physically collapse, slumping back into his chair, the utter look of devastation on his face, a mix of disbelief and the ultimate, crushing realization of familial betrayal. Marcus, his younger brother, his closest confidant and financial partner, had been my secret ally, disillusioned by Robert's mounting corruption and, more importantly, driven by the knowledge that Robert had secretly been plotting to frame Marcus for the entire cover-up if the scandal ever broke, and the final look of utter, soul-crushing betrayal that Robert shot across the courtroom, not at me, but at the empty space where he imagined his brother stood, was the ultimate victory, proving that the deepest cut always comes from the hand you trust the most. Yet as I watched him crumble, a terrifying thought struck me. Marcus had only provided the copy of the memo. Where was the original, and what catastrophic information did the original contain that Marcus had deliberately chosen to hold back, suggesting a dark secret even greater than the one I had just exposed? The courtroom dissolved into controlled chaos. Bailiffs moved swiftly toward Robert's table, not to restrain him yet, but to stand guard as the judge's clerk began to coordinate the communication with federal prosecutors. Ms. Thorne, her career potentially on the line, was frantically demanding a mistrial, her voice cracking with professional despair. Robert, however, was beyond caring about the legal minutiae. He was fixated on the betrayal of his brother, Marcus. He promised. We were a team. His voice was a raw, guttural whisper of shock and profound abandonment, a sound that finally shattered the strong, unshakable image he had cultivated for 30 years. For the first time he looked truly small, a defeated man stripped of his power and his last loyal ally. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. This was the vengeance I had silently worked for. But beneath the satisfaction, a complicated wash of emotions began to surface. Pity for the broken husk of the man I once loved, and a sharp, acute grief for the life that was now definitively, violently over. I had executed the perfect revenge, but the cost felt impossibly high. I was no longer just a wronged wife. I was the agent of his destruction, and that knowledge was heavy. He finally raised his head, his eyes locking onto mine, no longer with contempt, but with a terrifying, absolute hatred. "You did this, Elara," he spat, his voice trembling with venomous intensity. "You used my own brother, my own blood, to destroy me. You'll pay for this. You'll lose everything. Everything." His threat, however, felt hollow. He had no power left, only the raw, desperate fury of a king deposed. Yet, his final desperate words resonated with an unnerving conviction, suggesting that even with his assets frozen and his freedom at risk, he still held an ace, a final secret card that I hadn't anticipated, and the fear was a sudden, chilling blast of icy air, making me question whether the true danger lay not in the evidence I presented, but in the parts of his life and business that I still hadn't managed to fully uncover, the shadowy corners where he might have secured a contingency plan against utter ruin, perhaps involving the very people I had thought were on my side. The judge silenced the room with 3 sharp cracks of the gavel, his authority now absolute. "Mr. Jenkins," he stated with grim finality, "you are to surrender your passport to the court clerk immediately. I find that you have perjured yourself, concealed assets, and presented a clear and present flight risk. All assets listed under your name and Parnassus Ventures are seized pending a federal investigation." The weight of those words, the swift, crushing reality of his downfall, was intoxicating. The revenge, once a theoretical concept, was now a concrete, irreversible reality. Robert was escorted away from the table by the bailiffs, his demeanor shifting from rage to a defeated, almost catatonic state. It was over. But the process of revenge, I realized, was an exhausting and incomplete thing. Marcus's earlier betrayal of his own brother was a necessary evil, a critical component of my success, but it had introduced a new, chilling layer of complexity. The sheer fact that Marcus had only provided a copy of the damning memo, holding back the original, suggested that his loyalty was ultimately to himself and that he was leveraging the entire situation for his own protection, or worse, his own eventual takeover of Robert's legitimate business dealings. I had partnered with a snake to catch a viper, and now I had to deal with the lingering presence of the snake. My next step, already planned, was to move preemptively. I had arranged for an anonymous tip to be dropped to a prominent financial watchdog journalist, not about the medical device cover-up, which the court was handling, but about the suspicious timing of a recent transfer of a different, smaller company that Robert co-owned with Marcus. This would create a new line of inquiry that would, I hoped, implicate Marcus just enough to neutralize him as a threat without sacrificing my own confidentiality, a tactical maneuver designed to keep my temporary ally off balance and prevent him from capitalizing on his brother's downfall. But the risk was enormous, as exposing Marcus's duplicity could also expose my connection to him, which could potentially invalidate the evidence I had just presented and put me squarely in the crosshairs of both Jenkins brothers, leading me to question whether I had truly calculated the full extent of the collateral damage that my pursuit of justice and revenge would inevitably cause. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt like I was moving through water, the noise of the outside world muffled and distant. The revenge was sweet, but it hadn't magically healed 30 years of emotional wounds. I saw the flash of the paparazzi cameras, drawn by the sudden, sensational nature of the case, and I pulled my cheap suit jacket tighter around me, wishing I could disappear. The satisfaction was not in his pain, but in the restoration of my own dignity, the proof that the too poor, uneducated wife was the only one intelligent enough to dismantle his life's work. Yet the emotional toll was immense. I was 56 years old, officially divorced, facing a financial future that was suddenly secured, but incredibly complicated by federal investigations, and carrying the terrible secret of Marcus's involvement. My children, whom Robert had successfully turned against me with promises of inherited wealth, would now see their father exposed as a corporate criminal, a catastrophic realization that I knew would forever fracture our already strained relationship, and the pain of that impending breakdown was a sharper, deeper agony than the courtroom humiliation. The revenge was for me, but the fallout would be theirs to bear. I pulled out my phone, a burner I'd used only for communication with Marcus and the journalist, and hesitated. I had planned to send the anonymous tip immediately, but a wave of profound exhaustion washed over me. I needed a moment to breathe, to simply register the fact that the tyrannical force that had shaped the last 3 decades of my life was finally neutralized. But a delay was a risk. Marcus would be working quickly now, trying to secure his own position in the ensuing corporate vacuum. He knew too much, and his silence was bought only by his own self-preservation. I had to move now while the chaos was still reigning, but the simple act of pressing send felt like reloading the weapon for a second, more complicated, war against a new enemy who was more calculating and far less emotionally driven than Robert, and I wondered if Marcus had perhaps already anticipated my move. If the copy of the memo he gave me was not a lifeline but a carefully laid trap, designed to keep me preoccupied while he made his own final, decisive power play for the entirety of Robert's legitimate business dealings. I didn't get the chance to send the anonymous tip about Marcus. As I stood on the courthouse steps, shielded from the press by a kind-faced, retired court officer, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. Not on the burner phone, but on my personal line, a number only Marcus and Robert knew I used for family communication. The message was from an unknown number, and it simply read, "Your friend Marcus sends his regards. He thought you might like to see the original memo." Attached was a high-resolution photo of the water-stained document, but this version was different. The original copy, unlike the one Marcus had given me, had an additional paragraph at the bottom, meticulously handwritten and initialed by Robert and Marcus, detailing a massive undisclosed life insurance policy, a policy naming Marcus, not me, as the primary beneficiary, and tied explicitly to the successful disappearance of all Project Nightingale documentation. The policy was valued at $500 million. The blood froze in my veins. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a conspiracy. Robert hadn't trusted Marcus. He had bought his silence, and Marcus had only given me the expurgated copy to save his own skin from the initial scandal, not out of any sense of justice or loyalty to me. Marcus's true, devastating motive was now clear. He had orchestrated the entire exposure, using me as the unwitting catalyst to destroy Robert's corporate identity, allowing him to claim the massive insurance payout by proving the disappearance of the original files, all while I was safely preoccupied with the $93 million settlement. I was not the architect of revenge. I was a pawn in a $500 million fratricide. The terror was immediate and absolute. Marcus wasn't a snake. He was a viper waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and by using my phone, he was sending a direct, chilling message that he knew my every move, and the knowledge that I had just given him the perfect alibi, the public unveiling of the partial memo, while he stood ready to cash in on Robert's ruin, was a gut-wrenching realization, and the fear was not for my money but for my life, because the revelation of his $500 million true motive meant that I was now the only living person who knew about the full extent of his plot, making me a liability that Marcus would undoubtedly seek to immediately and permanently silence. My mind raced, the sheer scale of Marcus's calculated, ice-cold treachery, completely eclipsing Robert's pathetic corporate crimes. Robert's conviction was a certainty, but Marcus was walking away, $500 million richer, with no one suspecting his true role in the entire sordid affair. I had to act immediately, before he could execute the final steps of his plot. I opened my personal secure messaging app, the one I had established months ago with the single anonymous journalist I had previously vetted, and instead of sending the preemptive tip about the smaller company, I began typing a frantic, detailed message, attaching the photo of the full $500 million insurance policy memo that Marcus had just sent me, essentially turning his triumphant, threatening message into the final piece of evidence against him. Urgent new subject. Marcus Jenkins. Financial motive. $500 million life insurance payout tied to his brother's corporate collapse. I typed, my fingers shaking violently. I hit send, a final desperate Hail Mary pass to the public domain. But before the message could fully transmit, a second text from Marcus's number flashed across my screen. It was not a threat. It was a cryptic image, a zoomed-in photo of a small antique silver locket that I hadn't seen in over 20 years, a locket that contained the only photograph of my deceased mother, a piece of jewelry that had been inexplicably stored in a safe deposit box that only Robert and I knew the key to. The accompanying text was a single devastating sentence. The other copy of the memo. I found it right where your dear mother kept it. She wasn't the only one who didn't trust him. Was she, Ilara? The breath completely left my body. My mother, who had died suddenly 12 years ago, long before the Project Nightingale scandal broke, had somehow been involved, somehow knew about Robert's corruption, and had actively hidden a copy of the original memo, suggesting a secret relationship or an ongoing investigation into Robert that dated back years, a secret she had taken to her grave and that Marcus had just discovered, revealing a monumental, unspoken history of deception and a new, terrible layer to my own family's trauma. And the final shocking realization was that my entire revenge plot was not the beginning of the end, but merely the next act in a decades-long lethal family drama that began with my own mother's secret battle against the very man I had just married, leaving the entire future hanging on the question of what other secrets my mother had hidden to protect me, and whether the powerful Marcus had already found them all.